Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Medical Myths, the show about what not to do with your body. And today I am flying solo because this is a myth that I've really wanted to talk about. It's a big one, especially in the chiropractic and naturopathic communities. And it's very easy to, attack these claims that are so outlandish, such as homeopathy and, you know, uh, I don't know, the weird things of like inhaling uh, weird substances for COVID or the really outlandish claims are easy to debunk and they're easy for people to be skeptical about. But the thing is, I really want to take some time to talk about these claims that sound legitimate. Adrenal fatigue is something that has been perpetuated in multiple pseudoscientific communities. But the thing is, they take bits of truth and they misapply them, or they add things that aren't there, or they use terms in ways that they aren't meant to be used, and people don't know the difference. So this is something that's really dangerous, and people are profiting off of people's lack of knowledge on these areas. And so I did want to cover adrenal fatigue today. And before I really get into a lecture, because most of this today is going to be talking about physiology, so that when we address adrenal fatigue, you can go into it understanding the actual science behind it and what we would actually think about. And something that I want to say before we get into it is that the symptoms of adrenal fatigue are real. People that often are diagnosed with this fake condition of adrenal fatigue, they have real symptoms. They have real fatigue. They have real depression or anxiety. They have high stress levels, but it's not this diagnosis of adrenal fatigue. It might actually be something else. And so instead of investigating further and applying skepticism and the scientific method, people are slapping a label of adrenal fatigue on it and saying, you just need to decrease your stress, or you need to take my vitamins, or you need to buy my stuff, when actually your real symptoms could be caused by something else. Like it could be your thyroid, it could be anemia, it could be cancer, it could be depression, it could be a wide variety of things. And if you're not willing to look into it, and it could even be adrenal insufficiency, which we're going to talk about. Adrenal insufficiency is a real medically supported diagnosis. And we're going to talk about the difference between this proposed adrenal fatigue and adrenal insufficiency, because they don't align. They are not the same condition, and actual adrenal insufficiency presents in a certain way, and can be treated through medicine. So what exactly are we talking about with adrenal fatigue? So we'll come back to this article later on, but just to establish a definition of what they're claiming this is. So they're saying that adrenal fatigue is when your adrenal glands are exhausted and unable to produce adequate quantities of hormones, primarily cortisol, due to chronic stress or infections. Perhaps for some time now, you've been feeling not quite well. Maybe you felt extremely fatigued, lethargic, or even find it extremely difficult to grab a good night's sleep. If you have been constantly going through stressful situations lately, you might be experiencing what is known as adrenal fatigue. So they're taking some very vague symptoms, and fatigue is difficult. A differential diagnosis for fatigue is incredibly difficult because there are a lot of conditions that can cause fatigue. And this is really lazy. What they're saying here is that stress will cause your adrenal gland to produce so much cortisol that it no longer can produce anymore, and it just burns out. This is very similar to the mechanism of pancreatic burnout in diabetes. And I think they're being lazy, and they are applying the mechanism of diabetes to this and thinking that it relates. And this is intuitive. What they're saying is intuitive, which is kind of scary. And you could easily think to yourself, okay, yeah, if I'm under stress and I produce cortisol, then of course, it makes sense that your cells might get tired after a while. But we don't have evidence that these cells do get tired. And in fact, many things that we see in the mechanism for this proposed adrenal fatigue go against what we would expect in someone with low cortisol. So I'm going to take some time. We're going to go over to the physiology a lot today, and I'm going to draw. So I'm going to share. I'm going to share my Photoshop screen, and we're going to draw out the pathways for this. Okay. So we're going to start off with the adrenal gland. I'm going to draw a nice little triangle here. This is representing our adrenal gland. It sits on top of the kidneys on both sides, and the adrenals have multiple layers in them. So I'll draw out a few lines, and then we'll cover this. So when you are under stress, if it's a short-term level of stress, the first part that's going to make hormones is the medulla. So this part in here, this is the medulla, and it is responsible for secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these are secreted really quickly, and they go away really quickly because while they are hormones, they actually are regulated from the sympathetic nervous system. So something that stresses you out will produce these. And then cortisol is going to be a mechanism for prolonged stress. But this relates to the cortex. So these three layers out here are the adrenal cortex. And I have made videos on the adrenal before. If you've watched my talks about how the adrenal gland contributes to sexual development, you'll see the whole process of how these different hormones are synthesized and the enzymes involved in producing them. But we're going to take a big picture look at this today. So this first layer in the cortex is called the zona glomerulosa. And this is responsible for producing aldosterone. And aldosterone is responsible for reabsorbing salt in the kidneys. And that helps you absorb water. And this is going to regulate your blood pressure and fluid balance. The second layer is the zona fasciculata. And this produces cortisol. This is really what we're going to be talking about today. Sorry, my handwriting is garbage, but it is what it is. And then the third layer is the zona reticularis. And this is responsible for DHEA, which is the building block for testosterone and estrogen. So you get androgens in the adrenal as well. So we have these layers, and we're going to produce these hormones. We're going to talk a little bit about all three of these, but mostly focusing on cortisol today. So when we need cortisol, when we are under long-term stress, we're going to get a signal from the brain, and this is the pituitary gland. We have the hypothalamus up here. Hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is going to produce a hormone called CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. That's going to travel to the anterior pituitary, the antpit. And the anterior pituitary is going to secrete something called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this right here is what is going to cause the stimulation of these layers of the adrenal gland, and we are going to stimulate production of cortisol, aldosterone, and DHEA. Aldosterone is also going to be regulated by renin and that whole system. So ACTH doesn't act as much on aldosterone, but it does a little bit. So you get the stress, you produce ACTH. That's going to go to the cortex of the adrenal gland, cause release of cortisol. And then this cortisol is going to go to the bloodstream. So we have our bloodstream here. We have cortisol in the blood. And then the cortisol, it has four kind of main functions. So what does cortisol do? Cortisol causes increased blood sugar. That's kind of the main thing we're talking about with cortisol in terms of fatigue and energy balance. So you're going to increase blood sugar. And how this is going to happen is cortisol is going to go to, I'm going to draw a really terrible liver here. Cortisol is going to go to the liver and it's going to stimulate gluconeogenesis. So it's going to cause breakdown of fat and proteins in exchange for glucose. And then that glucose is going to be in the bloodstream to be used by organs, since if you're under stress, it is supposedly that you need more blood sugar, you need more ATP. So in order to produce this extra sugar to get your ATP, you're going to break down fat and protein, and you're going to get glucose. So this is the opposite of glycolysis. So cortisol is catabolic. It's going to cause breakdown of these and production of glucose. And then the glucose, of course, we're going to use that. Another function is going to increase blood pressure via stimulation of aldosterone receptors. So cortisol can also cause fluid retention, because cortisol functions not only as a glucocorticoid, but it also functions as a mineral corticoid. So your blood pressure is going to go up. It's going to decrease inflammation generally. And this is why if you are on a corticosteroid, that can be used to inhibit hypersensitivity reactions. That's why we use that for inflammation, because it just causes decreased inflammation. And it will also regulate the circadian rhythm. We'll get to that later. But it is helpful in wakefulness. Let me pause really quick and see if there are any questions in the chat. There's a lot that just happened. There's things about about owning kidneys. Okay. So here's the thing. We operate on something called feedback inhibition here. So you could theorize, and this is what the people are doing that are saying that adrenal fatigue is a thing. They are saying that if you are under stress, you're going to keep producing cortisol to such an extent that you're eventually going to stop making it. And this is not really possible because of feedback inhibition. So this whole process is regulated, and the amount of cortisol in the system, if you keep having stress and you keep producing, here, let me add a layer here because I'm going to add some colors. So if we increase our stress level, we're going to increase our CRH, we're going to increase our ACTH, increase our cortisol. And then what happens is you're not going to indefinitely increase your cortisol. You're going to get to a point where there's so much cortisol and so much glucose then being produced by gluconeogenesis that you're going to inhibit this cortisol is going to tell the brain that we don't need any more ACTH or CRH. We're going to stop producing those. And so then what's going to happen? Your cortisol is going to go down. So you're not going to produce an insane amount of cortisol and just have it keep being produced. You're going to stop producing it at some point. And this is important because they are ignoring this mechanism. But the next question is, how do we tell? So let's say we do have somebody who has low levels of cortisol. Okay, that happens. There's something called adrenal insufficiency, and I'll talk about that and the differences between what we see with that and what we see with adrenal fatigue. But anyone in the chat, I want you to try to tell me, how could we tell? Let's say someone had their adrenal gland and they could not produce enough cortisol. How could we test how much cortisol they have and their ability to produce cortisol? So a lot of times the people who perpetuate adrenal fatigue will say that you should test their salivary cortisol. And that is not the correct answer. And the reason why is because number one, the adrenal gland secretes cortisol on a diurnal pattern. So, like how I said, that cortisol is responsible partially for regulation of the circadian rhythm. If we have a graph here, and this is your cortisol over time throughout the day, cortisol over time, your cortisol level is going to be very high right when you wake up. And then it's going to decrease throughout the day. And then it's going to start rising again. So if we have here, this period here, this is when you wake up. And then somewhere over here is when you go back to sleep. If I tested your cortisol level in the morning, it's going to be high. If I test your cortisol level in the late afternoon, it's going to be low. So, as someone, if I were to market supplements for adrenal fatigue and I wanted to say, your organs are burnt out, you cannot produce enough cortisol, and I can prove it to you because I can take your cortisol in the evening and say, wow, your cortisol went down by 90% at the end of the day. You must be burnt out. But that's the natural pattern. That is how it's supposed to be. You are supposed to have a decreased level of cortisol. So if I can't use salivary cortisol, what can I use? And the answer is, think about this pathway that we just went over. If I don't have enough cortisol, let's say my adrenal glands don't work very well. So I have something called adrenal insufficiency. So here we have the adrenal cortex does not work. So what's going to happen here? We're going to undergo stress, right? We're going to undergo some stress. And when we do that, go back to the beginning, CRH is going to increase. That increase in CRH is going to increase the amount of ACTH, which is then going to go to the adrenal gland and it cannot produce cortisol. So we can't produce cortisol. So we can't do any of these mechanisms here, but also we cannot inhibit CRH or ACTH. So these are going to keep building. You're going to get a very high level of ACTH. So some things that we see with high ACTH and there's another hormone that is secreted along with ACTH that is called pro-opiomelanocortin, also known as POMC. And this causes pigmentation. And this is something that we see with Addison's disease or adrenal insufficiency. People get hyperpigmented because this is a precursor for melanin. But with this increase in ACTH and POMC, we can test someone's adrenal gland function by giving them ACTH and seeing if their cortisol levels rise. Right? So if ACTH stimulates cortisol synthesis and release by the adrenals, I can give somebody ACTH And if their cortisol goes up, then it's not a problem with the adrenal gland. Because then we know that the adrenal gland can respond to ACTH and it can increase cortisol. But if I give ACTH and it does not increase cortisol, then it could likely be that the adrenal gland cannot produce cortisol. So if I have this test, it's funny because these people, the chiropractors and naturopaths, they don't use this test because it does not show adrenal fatigue. It shows adrenal insufficiency. And also, something else that I need to mention about ACTH. When we're giving ACTH and knowing that in someone with low cortisol, you're going to have high ACTH. But what else does ACTH do? It stimulates hyperplasia. So it stimulates growth of the adrenal gland. So where people are saying that high amounts of stress are going to cause burnout, we actually see the opposite. We see growth of the adrenal gland. We see more production of cortisol because of this stimulation by ACTH. So if adrenal fatigue were a thing, it does not make sense with the mechanism because you would expect a bigger adrenal gland, you'd expect more cortisol. Or in someone who cannot produce cortisol, you would expect a large adrenal gland, at least, that's not producing the hormones, and a high amount of ACTH, and these other effects that you'd get with a high level of ACTH. You'd also see the effects of having low aldosterone and low DHEA. So, does that make sense? Does anybody have questions about this mechanism? Because understanding this and then going into the myth about adrenal fatigue, I think is going to send up some red flags that their mechanism does not line up with what we know. So I think if people want to type in questions, I'm going to talk a little bit about we can go straight into the adrenal fatigue and then we'll go into adrenal insufficiency after that. So these claims that they are talking about, let me stop this screen share. We're going to share the other one. All right. So this is a chiropractic website, and they, interestingly enough, they don't have an author listed. It is an anonymous article about the 4 stages of adrenal fatigue. And it's funny too, looking at this word cloud, they have some buzzwords. They have adrenal fatigue. They have diet, sleep, blood sugar. Okay, cool. Blood sugar is related to this. Cortisol is related to what we know to be true. Saliva test there, like we talked about. But then they have things like vitamin C, anxiety, slurred speech, apathy, things that really aren't related to this mechanism they're talking about. But anyway, vitamin C has nothing to do with your adrenal health. So they're saying adrenal fatigue has 4 stages on the path to adrenal exhaustion. During the 4 stages, our hormones and neurotransmitters can have levels that drastically fluctuate. But we know that in general, we have levels that fluctuate. So this isn't a sign that there's a problem. In each stage with adrenal fatigue, there are a combination of stress hormones and symptoms. Let's dive deeper into the 4 stages. So they're saying that stage 1 is the alarm or the alert stage. And they say this is the stage in which our body has an immediate reaction to the oncoming aggressive stressor. The stressor could be a threat or something very simple like a hospital visit or job interview. During the first stage of adrenal fatigue, our body can create significant numbers of hormones needed for the response. If a lab test were given during this stage, it would show elevated levels of adrenaline, cortisol, DHEA, norepinephrine, and insulin. At this point, fatigue is mild. Some will turn to caffeinated drinks, energy shots, sugary or high carb oriented foods. And this is funny. So, okay. Sure. Yeah. If you have some stress, you would probably see increased levels of norepi, epi, um, and cortisol. DHEA is kind of released, slower than this. It's also like androgens operate on a different kind of signaling mechanism. But something here, insulin is actually antagonized by cortisol. So that's something here that they're kind of confusing. Cortisol stimulates gluconeogenesis, which is the opposite pathway from glycolysis. Insulin is opposed by cortisol because insulin is going to cause sugar to go into cells. That's the job, to keep blood sugar out of the bloodstream. And cortisol's job is to encourage blood sugar to be in the bloodstream. So they are opposing hormones. So there's something that isn't really consistent there. And okay, you might have some fatigue. Sure. There's not as much sketchy about this section, but they are already starting to get some nuances incorrect. And that just kind of shows that they're not like they know enough about hormones to be dangerous. They know enough to make themselves feel like they understand and make other people feel like they understand this physiology, but they're missing details. So they're saying stage 2 is the dismay response, that our bodies have now been under severe stress and our cortisol levels will continue to elevate while our DHEA levels will decrease. Normal activities can still be carried out, but fatigue hangs warily on each day more and more. It will take longer to feel recovered or well rested. Our stress response systems will begin to feel overloaded, and the effects of overexerting the adrenals, which we just said isn't a thing. Symptoms will begin in our body, such as digestive issues, jitteriness, body aches and pains, irritability, nervousness, sense of sickness, depression, irregular sleep patterns, blood pressure elevated, etc. The term wired but tired comes into play during the stage 2 of adrenal fatigue. Many will develop a relationship with caffeinated drinks or coffee. The thyroid gland will become affected during stage 2. There's a lot here that does not really line up. So jitteriness, sure, with elevated cortisol. Nervousness, yeah, okay. And yeah, your blood pressure is going to be a little bit elevated. And DHEA, generally, yeah, if you're going to have higher levels of cortisol, you're going to decrease DHEA just because you're funneling resources to this pathway towards cortisol and not towards DHEA. But there's still a point where you have enzymes at capacity. You will reach a rate limiting step in this synthesis of cortisol. And once you hit that, there's a certain rate that it cannot exceed. And when you can't exceed that rate, you're going to funnel the extra resources over into pathways of DHEA and over into aldosterone. So you can't ever get to a point unless you have a genetic defect in your enzymes that would cause you to have a change in your rate limiting steps, a change in your enzyme function. You're not going to exceed this rate limiting step. You're not going to overwhelm this pathway to secrete an insane amount of cortisol. It's going to be regulated. All of these pathways are regulated. And what they're trying to say here, essentially, they're trying to communicate that there's dysregulation of the pathways. But you're not going to get dysregulation of a pathway such as this merely through prolonged periods of low levels of stress. And when any of this would be considered to be low levels of stress, even something that is very detrimental, even something that causes significant emotional distress, physiologically, that's still considered a low level of stress. When we are talking in medicine about high stress, we are talking about things like sepsis. We're talking about, brain trauma. We're talking very extreme physiologic scenarios. So I think we're using an equivocation fallacy. We are saying that they're saying that stress is related purely to emotional stress. And yeah, that's subjective. You can have something minor happen and you have an extreme emotional response. But that extreme emotional response is not going to cause you to have a similar physiologic reaction as sepsis or medication reaction. That's not realistic. And we'll get into that of where, because you can have something in adrenal insufficiency called an adrenal crisis. And these are things that you'd see with an adrenal crisis, but you'd also see some very extreme symptoms with an adrenal crisis. And this is not what we're seeing here, but they're trying to essentially say that this is a mild level of an adrenal crisis, which is not the case. But also, something here, they are talking about the thyroid gland becoming affected. And if you have thyroid gland involvement, it's probably not an adrenal problem. Let me stop sharing real quick again. I'm going to go back to the drawing. I'm going to go back to this drawing because, like I had said before, if you have your adrenal gland doesn't work, you increase ACTH and you don't get an increase in cortisol. So having low function or having absent function of the adrenal gland is not the only way you can get low cortisol, right? Because think about this pathway. We also have the hypothalamus and we also have the pituitary. So there are cases where, and this is called a secondary adrenal insufficiency, where it's not a problem with the adrenal, it's actually a problem with the pituitary and a problem with production of ACTH, right? So if I draw this out, if I can find my pen, if I draw this out, let's say that in this case, ACTH is the problem, or the pituitary is the problem. So we don't have a pituitary that functions, so we don't have ACTH. Okay, so we're going to have low levels of cortisol, right? We're going to have low levels of all of these. But it's because the pituitary is not working. And so in this case, if I were to give somebody high levels of ACTH, they would secrete more cortisol, because the problem wasn't in that they couldn't produce cortisol. The problem was that they couldn't produce ACTH. So if you supplemented ACTH, they produce cortisol. So if this were to affect the thyroid is also controlled by a different hormone that is secreted by the anterior pituitary, and also a hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. You have TRH and TSH, which cause the release of thyroid hormones. So if you get rid of the anterior pituitary, then you get rid of ACTH, but you also get rid of TSH. So that would affect the thyroid. But having adrenal dysfunction is not going to affect the thyroid in this manner. It's not. So they're wrong about that. Let me go back to that screen. Okay. So, stage 3. They're saying that our endocrine system during this phase will focus more on producing stress hormones. Okay. A substantial drop in DHEA will occur. Lack of enthusiasm will follow. Regular infections can be common. This is funny. I need to go into that point in a second. Restlessness, quality of life will dip. Almost simultaneously, once in this stage, exhaustion and anxiety will appear. Our bodies will try to conserve energy while we are not receiving adequate levels of cortisol. Adrenal exhaustion begins a catabolic phase in which our muscle tissue will break down to produce energy for our body. You will begin to feel the side effects of adrenal crash. So they are talking about adrenal crisis, except they're also not, because this is not what happens with adrenal crisis. But a few things here. So they're saying here, we now have a decrease in cortisol. But what did I say that cortisol did to the immune system? Cortisol is an immune suppressant, right? So if we decreased cortisol, we are decreasing inhibition on the immune system. So, increasing the immune system response, therefore, more capable of fighting infections and also more capable of autoimmune disease. But if you increase your cortisol, or like take an example of somebody who is on a prolonged course of a glucocorticoid, like they're on hydrocortisone for a long time, you're going to suppress their immune system and you are more likely to get infections, more likely to have opportunistic infections. So you would see regular infections with high cortisol, not necessarily with low cortisol. So they are flipping the mechanism in this paragraph, but to someone who doesn't understand the mechanism of cortisol, that would hypothetically make sense. But it doesn't. It does not line up with what we know to be true. And then here we go again. They're talking about a catabolic phase in which our muscle tissue will break down to produce energy for our body. And this, once again, is not going to happen with low cortisol. This is going to happen with high cortisol, right? Because as I mentioned, cortisol, in order to increase blood sugar, and that is the primary goal, you need to break down something to get glucose. You're not going to break down glucose to get more glucose. That would send you in a cycle, a perpetual cycle of breaking down glucose, breaking down glucose, making it again. It's useless. That's a useless cycle. So you need to use something else, such as fat and protein, catabolize them, make glucose. So what they're saying is not true with low cortisol. It's true with high cortisol. So once again, mixing that up. Stage 4, burnout or crash. And it's funny that of course they're using language that does not fit the same language that medical science uses, because we would call this an adrenal crisis, which has a specific medical definition for an adrenal crisis. But they can use different terms to kind of imply the same thing so that, they can apply it however they want instead of adhering to the medical definition of adrenal crisis. So they're saying most never reach this phase of total adrenal gland failure, which that wording is interesting. Total adrenal gland failure. That sounds like it should equate to adrenal insufficiency and potentially adrenal crisis. Right? But that's not what they mean. That's not at all what they mean. Our adrenal glands have ceased to function. That is a big, big claim, and that is a claim that we can demonstrate. And little can be done to restore our body's homeostasis. During the final stage of burnout, an individual can suffer from lack of sex drive, depression, restlessness, anxiety, and little to no interest in surroundings. Wait, hold on. So you'd have more anxiety with a decrease in cortisol? That doesn't line up. But also, this is a big claim that your adrenal glands would have ceased to function. And we can demonstrate that once again with an ACTH stimulation test. So we could do that. We could prove whether or not your adrenal glands are functioning. These naturopaths and chiropractors don't do that. They do not do that test because their lazy diagnosis could be proven false. And they don't want to risk that. And they're saying that little can be done to restore our body's homeostasis. This is false. We have ways to treat adrenal insufficiency. You can put somebody on fludrocortisone, which is an agonist of cortisol and aldosterone, because cortisol does also act on aldosterone receptors. You can treat this. You can restore homeostasis through glucocorticoids and mineral corticoids. You just supplement the things that they need. But chiros aren't licensed to prescribe steroids. So of course they're not going to tell you that that's the option because they can't prescribe it. They're going to prescribe their supplements and their therapies, because that more aligns with what they want you to think. That tells you that you need to come back and get all these treatments from us. You got to buy our products because that gives them money. And all this makes them feel very smart. But it's not consistent. So, I want to switch over briefly to adrenal insufficiency. We're going to talk about that. And then we'll go into, there's a website, the other website I found talked about what to do if you have adrenal fatigue and why that doesn't make sense either. So let me stop this screen. We're going to go to UpToDate, my favorite website of all time, my favorite database for medical knowledge. This is peer-reviewed science and the accepted standards of care and the accepted standards of diagnosis. So this is an article on clinical manifestations of adrenal insufficiency in adults. So they start to talk about adrenal crisis. We'll get to that in a second. So if you have chronic primary adrenal insufficiency, this is a case where you have deficiencies of glucocorticoid, mineralocorticoid, and androgens in adults. And this is an actual medical diagnosis. This is legitimate. And common features, we see some overlap with what we saw with adrenal fatigue, but we also see some things that do not make sense. So fatigue, absolutely. Absolutely. 84 to 95% of patients with adrenal insufficiency have fatigue. Cool. So you could, if you've been told you have adrenal fatigue, it's very possible that you do have a primary adrenal insufficiency. That is possible. But you can get weight loss. And I don't know if they specifically claimed in that last article that you gain weight. I know certain sites have made the claim that you gain weight with adrenal fatigue, but you'd actually expect to see weight loss, primarily due to the inability to eat. So when they say anorexia here, they're not saying the psychological aspects of anorexia. It's just the medical term meaning not eating. So just somebody who doesn't have an appetite, they don't want to eat. And dehydration, nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain you'd get, muscle and joint pain. But then also because these symptoms up here are very non-specific. You can have fatigue, weight loss, abdominal issues, and joint pain with a lot of things, right? You can have autoimmune disease. You could have diabetes. You could have hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. You could have multiple conditions that would cause any of those. You could be sick. You could have food poisoning. You could have the flu, would cause those. But some things that are specific, that skin pigmentation, like I said, POMC produced along with ACTH. You get high levels of that, you're going to get skin hyperpigmentation. You're also going to get, since cortisol acts on mineralocorticoid receptors, and also the fact that ACTH does partially have effects on stimulating aldosterone production, you get orthostatic hypotension. So you are dehydrated to a point where you don't have enough water in your blood, so you can't supply oxygen to all parts of your body because you just don't have enough blood. You're hypovolemic. So when you're laying down or sitting down, you might feel fine, and then you stand up and you get hypotensive. Like I know a lot of people might experience that, where you stand up too quickly and like you're seeing stars. You get kind of dizzy for a second. That's postural or orthostatic hypotension. And that's something that you're going to see with adrenal insufficiency because of the inability to produce cortisol and the inability to produce aldosterone. And salt craving along with that, because you have low fluid levels, you're going to crave salt because you are having trouble absorbing sodium. You're going to want more of it. You have reflexes that cause you to want salt to try to correct this imbalance. So you're going to find in these people, you're going to have hyponatremia. So if you got labs, you're going to find low sodium, you're going to find high potassium, and you're going to probably find anemia. So more evidence that we can get to show if you have adrenal insufficiency. Also, having anemia apart from Addison's disease, and that's the more colloquial name for adrenal insufficiency is Addison's disease. You can have anemia not related to this, but have other types of anemia, iron deficiency anemia, B12 deficiency, chronic bleeding, cancer can cause anemia, even things like sickle cell, hemolytic anemias. You can have those that would cause very similar symptoms to adrenal fatigue because you get tired, you get weight loss, nausea, abdominal pain, muscle pain, joint pain. You can get that with certain types of anemia. Sickle cell crisis, you can get a lot of these symptoms as well. So instead of just going with a spit test, a salivary cortisol level, what we should be doing, getting that ACTH stimulation test, getting a CBC to look for anemia, getting a CMP to look for your sodium levels and your potassium levels, also getting thyroid levels of TSH, T3, T4, getting testosterone levels, because low testosterone can cause a lot of these as well. We have more differentials than what they are saying, and the one test of a cortisol is not enough, and it would cause a lot of bias if you only got that, because we know, as I mentioned, it declines throughout the day. So it can skew someone's perception of what is going on in their body, and that's a problem when people are using that to sell their supplements or sell their treatments. So we have a lot of these. Yeah, they talked about fatigue, weight loss, salt craving, GI complaints. You can have psychiatric issues. You can have depression. You can have symptoms that sound like bipolar disorder. You can have symptoms that resemble depersonalization, because you're having changes with hormone levels, also changes with your hydration. You're not getting blood flow to the brain. You can have a whole wide variety of symptoms there, but it's important to actually investigate it and not just think that you have an answer when you don't. Medicine is not about finding a pattern and just saying, yes, I automatically thought of the right answer. That's bad medicine. Medicine is about thinking things over and really understanding the concept and asking questions of, how would I demonstrate that this is true or not? And that's it. That's what medicine comes down to. How do I demonstrate that this is true? And then what do I do about it when I find out what is true? So let's talk about adrenal crisis. So this is acute. This is what happens when you have an actual stressor, a significant stressor. And so they have here major precipitating factors. Some things can cause this, such as, have a list. Well, infection is a big one. Hemorrhage, infarction. So if you have a bleed around the adrenal, around the kidney, like a retroperitoneal hemorrhage, if you have an infarction, if you have their arteries, of course, that lead to the adrenals that supply them with blood. If you have a blood clot in those arteries and you're not getting blood flow, that could cause adrenal insufficiency. It becomes ischemic and dies. If you have trauma, if you have any number of those can cause actual physiologic stresses that can cause your adrenal gland to go into crisis. Something else I was going to point out here with this. Oh, yes. And well, this is actually more related to chronic insufficiency, is that one of the most common causes, I mean, you can get things like autoimmune disease that will cause adrenal insufficiency, but the major one, the most common cause of primary adrenal insufficiency is chronic steroid use, because you have that feedback inhibition. So if you supply an external source of cortisol, then you stimulate or you trigger that feedback mechanism. So you stop producing CRH, you stop producing ACTH, and you don't secrete your own cortisol. You get dependent on this outside source. So that is a way that you can shut down the pathway, but it's not burnout. It's not you producing so much that it's inhibited or that you just can't produce anymore. It's that it is inhibited by an increase from an exogenous source of cortisol. So that is a way that you can get adrenal insufficiency. And this crisis, so when you're in an adrenal crisis, this is dangerous and will probably land you in the ICU. So it's not something where you are just like feeling crappy for a few days or you're feeling tired. You probably will feel tired, but you will also probably have extremely low blood pressure because you're not retaining water. So you're going to be hypovolemic. You might have hypovolemic shock where you're not perfusing your brain. You can have hypotension or shock, abdominal, flank, back, or lower chest pain, fever in response to inflammation, nausea, vomiting, confusion, disorientation because you're not perfusing the brain, abdominal rigidity or rebound tenderness, which are signs of a surgical abdomen. This is emergent. So basically, well, also, I didn't mention, you can have hyperkalemia, so high levels of potassium, which something that really is important with that is cardiac arrhythmias. You can have heart issues with an adrenal crisis, and that's really dangerous. All of this is really dangerous. If you have an adrenal crisis, you probably know about it because you are probably in the hospital. So compare this, everything that we just talked about with the actual medical science of adrenal insufficiency compared to this very vague, non-specific, not even definition, because they don't even really define it super well, super vague umbrella catch-all term of adrenal fatigue. So let's go back to the article about what we should do about our adrenal fatigue. What did they want me to do when I'm stressed and I supposedly have burnout that isn't evidenced? We should do IV vitamin therapy. So this is funny. This is really, really funny. So, this is also a clinic that does IV vitamin therapies. So we have an IV, they want to give you an IV with vitamins. And they're going to say that this will cause your adrenal glands to work. In terms of, I guess I could actually read this. IV vitamin therapy, otherwise known as IV infusions, has been shown to enable patients with the ability to effectively recover from the vitality-sapping symptoms of adrenal fatigue in a markedly convenient and hassle-free way. Should you be leading an extremely stressful lifestyle, it's possible you're no longer able to do the things which maintain your overall health and wellness. This, of course, includes eating well. If you are suffering from adrenal fatigue, your nutritional health will definitely be hard hit. This is where IV vitamin therapy comes into play. This kind of treatment plan delivers an ideal combination of vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients straight into your bloodstream. This goes a long way in reversing any deficiency you might be experiencing due to adrenal fatigue. Secondly, your tired adrenals require you to be in good shape to initiate rapid healing. As with other injuries or illnesses, when your body is in good shape, the quicker and more completely the disease may be cured. This is also, it's funny when they say cure, when cure is not really a medically used term, because we manage disease. We don't cure disease. We treat and we manage. This is also so when it comes to healing your adrenals. By taking an IV vitamin infusion, your body will obtain the essential vitamins, minerals, and other indispensable nutrients that fast-track the healing process. Ideally, this therapy furnishes your body with the proper building blocks it needs to repair any damaged cells. These building blocks are integral in the context of your body being in a position to naturally heal your overworked adrenal glands. So, pop quiz for anybody in the chat. What is the building block? The primary, well, I mean, there's really only one building. What is the building block for cortisol? If they're saying that you need to supply your body with the building blocks to make cortisol, and that's part of your problem, what is the building block? Because I don't think they know. And I made several videos about this. It's not ACTH. That's a stimulating factor. But there's one molecule, one nutrient that is required to synthesize cortisol. Drew's got it. It is cholesterol. But they don't want to promote cholesterol because they think cholesterol's bad and they want to talk about diet. Yeah, so fat. You need cholesterol. Vitamins are not part of this. Vitamins are not the building blocks for any of this. And even in this pathway, we don't have cofactors. Some metabolic pathways have cofactors of vitamins. Like B6 is a notable one. That's a cofactor in the citric acid cycle. It's necessary to produce ATP. But we don't have those here. We don't have vitamins that are necessary cofactors in the production of cortisol. So you can watch my videos on this whole synthesis pathway. Go back and watch that where I break down the specific details of how these compounds are created. But the building block is cholesterol. So if we wanted to give somebody the building blocks, we'd give them cholesterol. But we also have evidence that your dietary consumption of cholesterol does not really play a huge factor in the amount of amount of cholesterol in your bloodstream, because you can produce your own cholesterol from the liver. So you do absorb some cholesterol from the GI tract when you need it, but excess cholesterol is not going to really be much different. So if you're probably not cholesterol deficient. If you are, that's a whole different issue. But yeah, a vitamin infusion is not going to provide building blocks for cortisol. But they can't sell cholesterol IVs. That'd be awful. So if you eat a meal within an hour after waking, that you did not allow your blood sugar levels to drop precipitously. There's not much to say about this. Like, I don't think really you're stimulating insulin with this, but again, insulin antagonizes cortisol. Cortisol antagonizes insulin. So that doesn't really, it does have an effect on your blood sugar levels, but it's not going to really affect your adrenal function. Skip processed foods. Love when they just, make processed foods the enemy. Stress can come from many different ways, one of which is by eating too many processed foods, which your body has a hard time processing. By removing them, you're supporting your adrenal glands returning to their natural state. No, the adrenal glands are not involved in, even if processed foods were the devil and gave you toxins, the adrenals don't process toxins. That's the liver's job. The liver does that. And even like processing, when we're talking processed foods, even something like pitting an olive is processing. Like, you can have food processing that does not in any way alter the nutritional value of a food. But they're gonna blame all processed foods because it's scary. People don't understand that it's a buzzword. It's a buzzword, and your body does not have a problem processing food just because it's processed. And it doesn't have anything to do with your adrenal gland. Nothing to do with it. Say no to high impact exercise. It's important to do low impact exercise when you're fighting adrenal fatigue. High impact exercise is another form of stress on the body, making it harder for your adrenals to repair themselves. Consider yoga, Pilates, or light cardio. What? So I think they don't understand the colloquial use of impact exercise, because impact is not like, when we're talking impact exercise, we're talking like weight bearing or like running on a hard surface, like things that cause physical stress to like the structure of the body. And we're not talking about metabolic impact when we say impact exercise. That's nothing to do with the adrenal function. Also, there's significant evidence that weight-bearing exercise is generally very good for your health. It is like preventing osteoporosis. High impact or like resistance exercise is beneficial. Resistance exercise is also very beneficial for weight loss. It's a kind of irresponsible to, tell people to stop doing that when there aren't any other indications to tell them to stop doing that. Say yes to fresh air. Okay, yeah, you can decrease your stress with walking outside. Cool. B vitamins. Again, they're saying that, vitamins are going to solve all your problems. Not going to do it. Get lots of sleep. Actually, I mean, I'm going to jump in on them with that. Like, and not to prevent adrenal fatigue, but sleep is good. Sleep hygiene is good. And I'm a bad example because I don't listen to my own advice on sleep. I'm very bad about my sleep hygiene, but sleep hygiene is important. And if you have good sleep hygiene, you're less likely to, be stressed because you're able to, consolidate your memories, be able to process things that happen during the day, and also, recharge. Terrible word, but you know what I mean. Recovery is done during sleep. Sleep is good. So I'll agree with them, but not for why they're saying it, but I will agree that that's important. Include protein. I mean, you should get protein. Protein is good. It contains amino acids such as tryptophan, which will relax your body. I mean, tryptophan, yes, is a building block of serotonin. So yeah, I mean, could contribute to less stress. But you should be including protein anyway. We know this to be scientifically valid. No caffeine. It's true that caffeine does increase cortisol, but this is not going to cause adrenal fatigue because your adrenals cannot be fatigued. Drinking caffeine will probably raise your cortisol levels, and that's how it actually, antagonizes that crash, that afternoon crash. If you have caffeine in the afternoon, you raise your cortisol. That's why you don't crash. But that's not going to prevent adrenal fatigue because we demonstrated that you cannot produce cortisol to such a high level that it would cause burnout. And we don't have evidence that the adrenal even burns out at all. Magnesium is a bad idea. And small amounts. If you're deficient in magnesium, sure, go for it. If you're taking a small amount, whatever. Dietary magnesium is fine. Yeah, like getting it from fish, avocado, beans, veggies, that's fine. Magnesium supplements, I wouldn't recommend because of risk of arrhythmias. Magnesium is a contributor to cardiac arrhythmias. Not the best. Not the best to just do that for funsies. Organic. They think organic is going to help. And this, again, going along with toxins. Organic is a buzzword. It means nothing. It's not going to, or eating organic or not eating organic is not going to do anything to your adrenal gland. You should be eating veggies. But it doesn't matter if they're organic or not. Drink half your body weight in water. No. I should do a whole episode on the obsession with hydration because it's actually problematic to be overly hydrated. And I'll get into that in a different video, but you don't need to hydrate excessively. Like, please don't hydrate excessively. If you have adrenal insufficiency, if you have Addison's disease, you are going to have a harder time being hydrated. That is true. And you might need to have IV fluids more frequently. And you might, because you're not able to absorb, oral fluids. But for most people, that's not a concern. Epsom salts. This is funny. This is funny to me. If you had, so think about this really quick. Think about this. If you put salt in water and so if you take a human that's dehydrated, because if you have adrenal fatigue or adrenal insufficiency, you are more than likely dehydrated due to lack of aldosterone. If I take someone who's already dehydrated and put them in a salt bath, are they going to get more hydrated or less hydrated? This is a problem. You don't put someone that's already dehydrated in an environment that's going to only further dehydrate them. That's dumb. That's really dumb. Don't do that. Meditate and relax. Meditation, sure, is okay. It's good for people to do. Essential oils aren't going to help your adrenal glands. But I mean, if you like aromatherapy, go for it. Like, self-care is good. Not going to really do anything to your adrenal gland, though. And eat regular meals. I mean, we kind of talked about that already a little bit. But so this is what they want you to do. And what are they selling? What are they selling? Well, they're selling IV hydration, number one. So you can get a single IV for the ultimate IV solution for $199, or you can get a package of them for $800. You can get an immunity solution to boost your immune system for $169. You can get a metabolism solution for $150. They are selling bullshit. They are telling people that they have adrenal fatigue and that you need IV vitamin therapy because they can get $200 off of you. People that are possibly not in a financially decent situation. I think most people who go for this stuff have money. Like, most people that don't have a lot of money aren't gonna, go for an IV hydration that's $200. But if you're convincing people that they need this and that now they're in emotional stress because they can't afford this treatment that you're telling them that they need, like, you're telling them that you have the answer to solving their fatigue problem and to making them have a better productive day, and you're saying that they can't have it because they don't have money. That's going to put more stress on them, right? This is misleading, and this is bad. Also, don't do an IV of NAD plus. Like, NAD is involved in production of, glutathione and things. It helps fight free radicals, yes. But it's also a niacin-based supplement. That's bad. You don't need that. I could do a whole video just talking about dysregulation of your whole metabolic process with this, like what this would do. This is ridiculous. They also have diagnostic testing, and this is horrifying. So how do you tell if you have adrenal fatigue or if you have health issues? Apparently, you don't get an ACTH stimulation test. You don't get a CBC or a CMP. You don't get a TSH. You get these diagnostic tests that cost you, the most expensive one on here, test for 160 plus biomarkers. They're testing DNA tests for your nutrition and lifestyle plan. For $1,099. You can get a detox solution. Identify toxic elements in your system for $350. You can find out, here you go, the saliva test for stress. So I'm guessing this is the salivary cortisol test, which they will tell most people that you have low cortisol because it goes down anyway. $329. This is a scam. Kids, they are targeting children. A kid-friendly way to see your child's nutritional report card. No needles, no blood, just accurate results to see how your child is doing nutritionally. A DNA test. $500 for a scam. This is not okay. This is not okay. And also, they don't have a single physician on staff at this place. They have a nurse practitioner. They have nurses. They do not have a single physician. And this is all dishonest. This is all bullshit. You can also get vitamin boosters. Look at this. And COVID tests. So you can get injections of vitamin B, vitamin C, and glutathione for $70. You can get a CoQ10 booster for $35. You can get a weight loss shot for $35. Antioxidant booster for $35. This is dishonest, and this is such a scam. I mean, I'm curious to know, like, it seems like their business is doing decently well, but I mean, they have a good website. They know how to market. Are the staff members skilled? My goodness. No, they do not know what they're talking about. This is all pseudoscience. This hurts. This really hurts. I think I'm going to end that there because we've covered most things that I really wanted to get to with this. But basically, this is harmful. This is not benign. And saying that you have an answer that is not backed by science and an answer that, causes people to be targeted by these scammy DNA tests and these scammy vitamin infusions and shots is dangerous. This is harmful. And someone could get this diagnosis from their chiropractor or their naturopath, and they think, hey, I have an answer. I know what is going on with my body, and now I know how to treat it. And let's say, what if this person had cancer? What if this person had depression? If they had adrenal insufficiency and could be at risk for a crisis? What if they had that and they didn't go to get evaluated by a qualified physician because some naturopath gave them a diagnosis of adrenal fatigue? This is why it's problematic. People die from this. So, I hope that this is a more serious episode today, a lot more heavy in terms of scientific content. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, put them in the comments. You can send me questions on Twitter as well, or in the Facebook group, because we have a Facebook group now. If you want to join the Facebook group, here I'm going to put my link tree in the side chat. That's going to have it's going to have the link to the Facebook group, the Discord, the Twitch, everything. So you can go to any of those links. Also, what else we got going on? We got trivia nights on Fridays at 9 p.m. Eastern time. We have medical myths Actually, next week, this is a great announcement. We do not have Medical Myths next week because we're doing something extra special. We are hitting the 1 year anniversary of my YouTube channel. So next week, we're going to have a big 1 year celebration spectacular on this channel. It might go a long time. I'm predicting maybe 3-4 hours of fun. I have a highlight reel from both Medical Myths. We're going to watch some Medical Myths highlights. We're going to watch the highlights from some of the Twitch streams. We also have, I think I'm going to make a trivia game for Medical Myths trivia that everyone in the chat can play. So if you want to brush up on topics we've talked about in Medical Myths, we'll do a trivia there. I think I'm going to do another giveaway because I made some new merch for Medical Myths. So I will be giving away Medical Myths merch to people that show up to the event. It should be a great time. I'm expecting some of the previous guests on Medical Myths are going to make an appearance, but it'll be a great time. Please join me. That's going to be at the same time we usually do, 2 p.m. Eastern time next week on this channel. And then, of course, let's thank the patrons. We got a new patron this week. So thank you, Reggie, Kevin, Bino Just B, and Haney Ball. Thank you for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it. And I hope to keep growing this channel. And I'm excited to see where we go in this next year. It's been a wild ride. I'm happy to be here. Happy to have you all with me. And after this, for the patrons, we do have the after show, exclusive Patreon after show where we goof off and have a fun time. Not sure what we're going to do today in the after show. We'll kind of play it by ear. So if you are a patron, let me know what you want to see today. And I'll see you over there in a few minutes. But anyway, thank you everybody for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you all in the next one.